We're just going to take a few minutes now to explore some of the ideas that have come up here. And I wanted to start by saying a lot of people are very afraid to speak out, and understandably so. And do you think that it's getting easier to speak out? I don't know if any of you want to actually take that on.
I think things are opening up a bit. For example, I think at UCL we've moved forward in the last few years. For example, we had a vote at academic board at UCL to leave Stonewall. And the great thing about that was, we won really decisively. There was a meeting of over 300 people. 2/3 to 1/3 voted to leave rather than to stay. And so people start to realize that our view is the majority position, which you can see in any opinion poll. But people can see that that's true for their colleagues as well. And I think that does really help.
And I think also that, as Jo said, the forced out of judgment is really significant, because it was always emotionally terrifying to speak out and then find yourself targeted by abuse and harassment of the kind that Jo's described. But it was also really terrifying because you could actually be forced out of your job. But what the forced out of judgment has given us is the security that at least the belief that there are only two sexes and that people can't change sex is protected in law. So although you might still get the abuse and harassment, you can't legally be fired for holding that belief. I find the idea that it's belief deeply problematic, but that's where we are, and that has made a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, university, for those of you, could you turn the house lights up for a second, please? Or not? Thank you. How many of you actually work in or study in a university at the moment? Can you just raise your hands? Okay, so a good few of you. You can put the house lights down again if you want. Universities are unlike every other organization. From my experience, universities work on an economy of favors. You actually need to be in good keeping with most of your colleagues. We have supposedly objective criteria. I am answering the question, by the way. We supposedly have objective criteria for promotion, but those objective criteria are interpreted by a panel of your supposed peers, right? So if you fall out of favor, then the way in which those objective criteria are interpreted can operate to your disadvantage. So are people afraid? I think they're less afraid the more people like us speak and the more we're able to gather like this. It's great. But there is still a point where, what do they say, the road meets the tarmac, or the tire meets the tarmac, where actually if you're a junior lecturer, if you're just a lecturer and you want promotion, you need the people on the panel to think kindly of you, to write good references, to see your work as credible. So I think, no, the workplace culture hasn't changed yet. I'm hoping this court case will help. I don't know what will help, because we've got to deal with the production of the culture of acquiescence and silence.
You've talked quite a lot, Jo, in the past, and when I interviewed you for The Telegraph, you talked about the emotional impact on you, and that's been quite severe, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. I find it, Selena Todd has a wonderful line that we shouldn't actually kind of position ourselves as victims in this story. Because in many senses, people like me and Alice and Judith, we aren't. We're the ones who are standing up and talking. But that doesn't mean there isn't an emotional consequence. And earlier on, we were all sat down in the green room, and I mentioned to Alice and Judith, I think, that if I wasn't working at the OU, I might not have taken the case. But it had a massive impact on me. I ended up with PTSD, and I still get a little bit, twitchy from time to time. And I think that had to do with the fact that I was working in an organization that was so captured, so utterly captured. It was like the air. Stonewall was the air that people breathed there. So to challenge that was to challenge the basic precept of the university. And it was very, very lonely. Not so at Reading. Reading is fantastic. We've got a vice-chancellor that understands people can protest. believe there's a protest outside. That's great. Everyone's allowed to protest. But that people aren't allowed to harass. And I think that's the difference at the OU. There was just an untold amount of harassment.
Have any of you ever felt that you're self-censoring in any way, or that you've had to not talk about certain subjects?
Oh yeah, frequently.
What kind of examples?
There are things that I used to unthinkingly mention in my teaching, and this doesn't come up for me on a daily basis because I'm not in gender studies, but I do, over the years, often used to refer to second-wave feminist political philosophy, for example, and commonplace distinctions like the distinction between sex and gender, and sort of point out that everybody is born with a sex and that we're socialized differently. And I didn't used to think twice before saying that in class or putting it on a slide. And I have found myself not omitting those kind of points, but being very anxious about whether I can say them, how I can say them, how students are going to react. There have been times when I've been in seminars where people have said things that I thought were completely outrageous or conceptually confused, and I've decided to just say nothing because I don't want to create an antagonistic environment in the seminar room. So yes, and it's sad because academia is supposed to be a space where we have disagreements and debates and discussions, and where we are able to, have quite serious disagreements, but still treat each other in a civil way. And it feels sometimes like it's no longer that kind of space, and that is difficult.
Jo, you've talked a lot about colleagues. What about students?
I have to draw a distinction. At the OU, we don't have contact with students,
right,
which is it's an oddity. The central academics write the courses, and then the caterer of people deliver them. What was the question?
Well, I was thinking more in terms of, have students contacted you because they've been looking at your work and not liked it?
No, it's been the opposite. So despite all of the grim stories that I can tell and have told, and despite all the grim stories that do surround a lot of the work that we all do, one of the things I found most fascinating since coming out, not as a lesbian, I've been out for a long time, but just coming out as a gender-critical feminist, is the number of students who contact me and say, can you tell me more? Can you give me a reading list? I'm really interested in this. People don't talk about this on my course. And I get emails from literally all over the world. People looking for reading lists in particular. And also a lot of the very young students, so the 18 and 19-year-olds coming up and saying, what is this second wave feminism? So even just the basic understandings that we have are being lost. And I find that a tremendously hopeful thing. I think there's a great hunger out there. So that's the students who contact me rather than
Well, that's very interesting, because there's often an idea that it's a generational divide, isn't there?
Yeah. I don't think there is. I think we are the bearers of our experience, aren't we?
Yes.
So we know what we know, partly because we've lived through all of this. And I think I've had a lot of young feminists, particularly at the conferences like Philia, come up to me and say, thank you for all the work that you've done, and I'd get embarrassed, and then I say, oh, but what are you doing? And they talk about the generational divide as being one, they mention it, but it's one like, we'd like to learn from you, which I just find tremendously hopeful.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's quite important to talk about resilience, because I can understand people not wanting to position, any of us wanting to position ourselves as victims. But at the same time, I do think there's an emotional cost to dealing with this over and over again. And I think one of the, for me, I come at a different angle because I'm a journalist, and it's just, for me, it's partly not being able to write for newspapers that I wrote for many years, where there's now a hostile atmosphere, and you can feel very isolated when that happens. And I think talking about it and comparing experiences is one of the ways that you develop resilience. Do you think that's right?
I think so, but I also think sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but things like this are actually tremendously, I hate to use the word healing because I don't mean it in a therapeutic way, but actually they create a moment where you actually have a connection with other people, and it's real and it's visceral, and there are people in a room listening, and that's real and visceral.
But building networks and organising, I think, is so important. I think anyone who's isolated on their own in a university trying to do this work in the way that, say, Kathleen Stock was, that's just an impossible situation. I don't know how she managed to do that for as long as she did. At UCL, we have each other. We have UCL Women's Liberation, so we have an organisation, and we have a wider network of academics who care about academic freedom. So I think that's so important. You've got to build a network and you've got to organise. You can't try to do this work on your own.
I'm not a huge fan of the word resilience, I have to say. I mean, I'm not sure if I've become more resilient. I mean, it's certainly true what Alice said, that you need support, you need a network. I think there have been several moments over the past few years when we've been in each other's office in tears, offering each other cups of tea, and without that, I think I probably wouldn't have got through some of the things that have happened. Both of us and other colleagues, but also, it's still emotionally. It doesn't mean that it's not hurtful the next time it happens. I'm not sure that resilience is quite the right word. In a way, it just makes you angrier, and I think if you can channel that anger into something productive, then it's a good thing. And if you don't have that network to think, okay, how can we take this and do something constructively with it, then it just becomes a very painful thing that you have to live with. Yeah.
Why do you think that there's such a difference between universities? I mean, you've talked about Reading, which is my old university, is a very different environment. Is it simply down to personnel, to who's in the higher echelons of the university?
I mean, I don't know what Alice and Judith think about this. I've been a bit promiscuous in my academic career. I've worked at 7 different universities. Most people don't move so much. And having worked at so many universities, I think who's at the top table matters a great deal. And of course, Reading University had the encounter of the harassment of Rosa Freeman. And I think that was such an extreme example that they had to figure out how to deal with this. And Robert van den Noort, the VC at Reading, is an extraordinary individual. And he had the charter of the university rewritten so that academic freedom is the second thing on the charter of the university. So that makes a difference, and it changes the entire culture. I now work in a law school with lawyers. I don't know what they think about. I have no idea what they think about, trans and sex debates and gender criticalness and all of that. All I know is that they often say, what can we do to help you, because you're carrying a burden, not just of your full-time job, but a high-profile court case. What can we do to help you?
Gosh, that's very impressive.
Yes, it is.
Have you had that sort of support?
Well, no, I would say at departmental level, yes.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think the top table is important, but actually I think what we've experienced at UCL is actually within the Institute of Education, which is the faculty that we're in. We've had support from very good heads of department, and I think that's just as important in a different way, and also just from very good colleagues.
So how do you see things going forward? Do you think that the freedom of speech is becoming more recognised in universities, or do you think it's going to take too long to get Stonewall out?
I don't think this is just about Stonewall. I mean, I know Stonewall is being depicted here as the sort of big bad bully, but I think they're symptomatic of a bigger problem. And this, we're here to talk about, women's liberation and sex-based rights, but there are other issues on which freedom of speech is deeply compromised in universities through the same kind of political mechanisms. So I think it's a broader issue. I'm not convinced, actually, that it's getting better, because I think students in some certain places are becoming more censorious.
Yeah, I'm not sure, though, that it's primarily about students, because it has to come down to staff, in that, students won't behave the way they did, for example, at Sussex, unless they're being backed up. And the experience that we've had often at UCL is actually, it's not students, it's a small number of staff who are harassing us and attacking us, trying to stop us from holding conferences and so on. And their staff often in EDI roles.
Yeah.
And getting rid of Stonewall is a really good first step, but it's not enough when you've got this whole culture which is based on people pursuing a very narrow form of activism and doing it as part of their job in a completely inappropriate way, which actually is counter to any real belief in diversity and inclusion, which is what they claim to be working towards.
And I think the wider political climate and economic climate in which universities are operating is also a big part of the problem here, because universities are being forced to act like businesses. So they're dependent on their customer base, they're dependent on turning a profit, they're hugely concerned about their reputation. So, that can work both ways, but they operate like businesses who are managing their reputations much more than like public institutions with a duty to pursue the truth at all costs. And until there's a bigger political shift in terms of funding and secure contracts, then it's going to be very hard to make that move, I think.
Can I just follow up on something both of you said? We were talking again earlier, and one of the things that has changed, and it's changed really since they brought in something called the Research Excellence Framework, which is an audit of all the universities' research capacity. It used to be that universities were ranked on things like research income, PhD students, number of publications, quality of those publications. But then they introduced something called impact, which is the effect that your research has had in the big bad world. This has created at least 2 generations now of academics who think that their main orientation is not towards the production of truth or science, but the effect in the outside world. Now that has a cancerous effect ultimately, because what that then generates are people who are more interested in activism. So for me, it isn't Stonewall that's the big baddie, although I used a lot of Stonewall things in there. It's the academics who have swallowed the Kool-Aid, for lack of better words, and actually think that their role is to change the world in a particular vision, a political vision. So I personally am not very hopeful. I think that we've got to see this cycle out, and hopefully some of the younger academics that we're training now, the ones, all of you who had your hands up, anyone who's like 18, 19, 20, 21, just coming into universities, I think that the change will come from that generation rather than ours.
I'm not very fond of the word inclusivity, because in journalism it means that The Guardian prides itself on being inclusive, and there's a whole load of people like Suzanne Moore and Hadley Freeman and Julie Bindler and me who can't write for it.
Yeah.
And that's, it's all about inclusivity, and it ends up as exclusion.
Yeah. By definition, you can't have the word inclusion without exclusion.
Exactly. Yes. Is there anything we haven't covered that any of you wanted to say or burning to address before we go to questions?